Olivia had always been drawn to history's mysteries. As a historian with a passion for the unexplained, she sought out legends, stories of the supernatural, and forgotten places that lay dormant for centuries. Among these was the infamous mansion known as the House of Echoes. Rumors about this mansion had circulated for decades, with each telling growing more unsettling. Locals claimed that it wasn't just haunted. The mansion itself was alive, listening to those who dared enter and twisting their words against them. It was said that once you crossed its threshold, it began to know you, repeating your own fears back at you in whispers that would drive the sanest person mad. Intrigued by these dark tales, Olivia decided to investigate the mansion for her latest research project. After weeks of correspondence and negotiations, she obtained a special permit from the town council to explore the mansion's decaying interior. They had given her the mansion's key, a cold, rusted artifact that seemed to hum in her hand, as if acknowledging her role in its long history. When she arrived at the mansion at dusk, she was greeted by a sight that made her pause. The mansion stood ominously at the end of a gravel path, surrounded by overgrown hedges and trees that clawed at the sky with their twisted branches. Its stone facade was cracked and covered in ivy, and its windows, darkened and covered in grime, seemed to watch her approach. Despite its state of decay, the mansion retained an air of grandeur, a shadow of its former glory that both fascinated and unnerved her. The atmosphere around the mansion was thick, almost suffocating. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves at her feet. Olivia swore she heard faint whispers carried by the breeze, but she brushed it off as nerves. With a deep breath, she pushed open the creaking iron gate and approached the front door. Her heart pounded as she inserted the heavy key into the lock, the sound of the turning mechanism echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The door swung open with a slow, ominous creak, revealing a darkened interior that seemed to swallow the fading daylight. She hesitated on the threshold, feeling a chill creep up her spine. She knew this was the point of no return. Taking one last glance at the world outside, she stepped into the mansion's depths, the door slamming shut behind her with a force that made her jump. The echo of that slam resonated through the entrance hall, a foreboding sign of what lay ahead. As Olivia stepped into the mansion's entrance hall, the darkness swallowed her. She switched on her flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the dust-filled air. The hall was grand, its high ceilings adorned with elaborate moldings that had long since begun to crack and peel. Faded wallpaper covered the walls, and heavy curtains shrouded the windows, blocking out the last rays of daylight. An eerie silence settled around her, amplifying the sound of her own footsteps on the creaking floorboards. Each creak echoed, reverberating through the vast, empty space, lingering longer than seemed natural. It was as if the house were listening, amplifying each sound she made. As she moved deeper into the hall, her flashlight illuminated rows of old portraits hanging on the walls. The faces in the paintings were obscured by layers of dust and grime, but she could make out their outlines, figures dressed in attire from centuries past, their expressions frozen in time. She shuddered, feeling their eyes on her as she passed. A grand staircase loomed at the end of the hall, its wooden steps covered in a thick layer of dust, suggesting it had not been tread upon in decades. Yet, the air around her carried a strange sense of anticipation, as if the house had been waiting for her arrival. She reached into her bag, pulling out her voice recorder. "The mansion appears abandoned," she whispered, pressing the record button. No signs of recent activity. The sound of her voice echoed softly, then faded into the shadows. She played back the recording, and her heart skipped a beat. Alongside her own voice, she heard a faint whisper repeating her words. Abandoned. Activity. The echo was distorted, almost as if the mansion itself had mimicked her voice. A chill ran down her spine. She glanced around the hall, scanning for any sign of movement. There was nothing, only darkness and the outlines of forgotten furniture draped in dusty sheets. She shook her head, convincing herself that it was just an acoustical anomaly. Old houses had a way of warping sound. It was nothing to be afraid of, she assured herself, though doubt lingered at the edges of her thoughts. The whispers continued as she moved through the hall, barely audible yet persistent. "Olivia," they sighed, drawing out her name in a haunting tone. She froze, every hair on her body standing on end. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. Silence followed. Then the echo replied, "Hello," distorted and mocking. Panic surged through her, but she forced it down, reminding herself why she was here. This was just a part of the mansion's legend, one she was determined to understand. Gathering her courage, Olivia moved further into the mansion, finding herself drawn to a room on the right. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing the mansion's parlor. It was a vast room, lined with old, ornate furniture covered in thick layers of dust and draped in white sheets that resembled ghostly figures in the dim light. Heavy curtains hung over the windows, blocking out any hint of the outside world, leaving the room bathed in darkness. She swept her flashlight across the room, its beam catching glints of tarnished silver and the faint shimmer of cobwebs. At the far end of the room stood a grand fireplace, its surface blackened from years of neglect. Above it hung a large, ornate mirror, its glass fogged and cracked with age. She approached the mirror cautiously, feeling an inexplicable pull toward it. Wiping away the grime with her sleeve, she peered into the glass. Her own reflection stared back, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She squinted, leaning in closer as the room around her grew eerily silent. Then, without warning, a whisper filled the air, soft yet distinct. "Turn back." The voice was faint, as if spoken from far away, but the words were unmistakable. Olivia spun around, her flashlight beam darting across the room. There was no one there. She felt her pulse quicken, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaky. The room remained silent, the only sound the pounding of her own heart. She lifted the voice recorder to her lips. "I'm in the parlor. There seems to be activity," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. She played back the recording, and her blood ran cold. As before, there was her voice, and then a faint, twisted echo. "Parlor. Activity." The sound seemed to come from all directions, surrounding her. She backed away from the mirror, her eyes fixed on the room's shadows. The door she had entered through slammed shut with a deafening bang, causing her to drop the voice recorder. It skittered across the floor, its blinking light casting unsettling patterns on the walls. "Let me out," she screamed, rushing to the door and grabbing the handle. It wouldn't budge. The whispers rose in volume, becoming a cacophony of overlapping voices that filled her head. "You're not alone," they chanted, the words looping and twisting around her. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled out of the parlor. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each one echoing eerily in the hallway. She needed to regain control, to rationalize the situation. The whispers, the echoing, the door slamming. Old houses like this often had structural quirks. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. Her flashlight beam wavered across the hall, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to dance along the faded wallpaper. Her eyes locked onto the grand staircase at the end of the hall. It rose in a sweeping curve, its banister once polished and grand, but now covered in dust and cobwebs. A cold draft emanated from its depths, raising goosebumps on her arms. The staircase seemed to beckon her, daring her to explore its upper floors. She approached it slowly, every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet amplified into a mocking echo by the mansion's cavernous interior. She hesitated at the foot of the staircase, looking up into the darkness above. The second-floor landing was barely visible, shrouded in shadow. Olivia felt a chill run down her spine, as if the darkness were watching her, waiting for her to make a move. She swallowed hard, then placed one foot on the first step. The wood groaned beneath her weight, the sound echoing up and down the staircase like a warning. Halfway up, she paused, gripping the banister tightly. A whisper floated up from behind her, faint but clear. "Go back. You don't belong here." Her breath hitched, and she turned sharply, her flashlight scanning the hallway below. Nothing, only the empty darkness stretching out like an abyss. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, and continued to climb. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the mansion itself were pushing against her ascent. Finally, she reached the top of the stairs, stepping onto the landing with trepidation. The hallway stretched out before her, lined with closed doors that seemed to pulse with an almost living energy. She approached the nearest door, reaching for the tarnished brass knob. It felt cold to the touch, sending a jolt through her fingers. Slowly, she turned it and pushed the door open. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, the air stale and heavy. Olivia hesitated before stepping inside, her flashlight sweeping the area. Old furniture sat in ghostly silence, draped in sheets that had yellowed with age. A thick layer of dust coated everything, disturbed only by her intrusion. The floor beneath her creaked loudly, the sound echoing unnervingly in the stillness. Suddenly, a faint rustling filled the air, like the whisper of fabric brushing against the floor. She whipped around, her flashlight darting through the shadows. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking slightly. Silence followed, then a soft, mocking echo of her own words. "Who's there?" The whisper was distorted, stretched into a chilling parody of her voice. Her skin prickled with fear, but she forced herself to move deeper into the room. She approached a large wardrobe in the corner, its doors slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, she reached out and flung the doors open. Inside hung a row of tattered clothes, long abandoned. The air inside was freezing, a stark contrast to the rest of the room. A whisper drifted out of the wardrobe, faint but unmistakable. "Leave, before it's too late." Olivia staggered back, her heart pounding. The voices weren't just random sounds. They were coming from the house itself, responding to her presence. The mansion was aware of her, learning from her words, twisting them into warnings or threats. She glanced at the floor and noticed something peculiar. Faint footprints in the dust, leading to the room's far corner. She followed the trail cautiously, her flashlight revealing another door hidden in the shadows. It was small and narrow, almost as if it had been built to remain unnoticed. With a trembling hand, she turned the knob and opened the door. A narrow, spiraling staircase descended into the darkness below. She hesitated, the whispers growing louder around her, urging her to turn back. But she knew that she couldn't stop now. She had to find out what the mansion was hiding. The descent down the hidden staircase was slow and treacherous. The steps were steep, worn smooth by time, and the air grew colder with each step she took. Olivia's flashlight flickered ominously, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. The staircase seemed to stretch on forever, spiraling downward into the mansion's depths. A sense of dread filled her, mingled with a grim determination to uncover whatever secrets lay below. Halfway down, she paused to catch her breath. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the stone walls around her. They overlapped, creating a cacophony of voices that made her head spin. Some were distorted echoes of her own words, while others were unfamiliar, like a chorus of long-forgotten souls trapped within the mansion's walls. "Why are you here? Here," they chanted, the words bouncing around her in a dizzying spiral. Olivia pressed on, feeling the temperature drop sharply. The air became thick and damp, carrying the faint scent of decay. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, her knuckles white as she descended into the darkness. Finally, the staircase ended, leading her into a small, windowless room. She stepped into the chamber, shining her light around. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one cracked and fogged with age. Her reflection stared back at her from every angle, fragmented and distorted. She approached one of the mirrors cautiously, peering into its fractured surface. To her horror, the image within began to change. Her reflection twisted, morphing into different versions of herself. Some gaunt and hollow-eyed, others contorted in expressions of rage or despair. She stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. The whispers grew frantic, filling the room with overlapping cries and murmurs. "You're lost, lost, lost," they hissed, their tones mocking and pitiless. Olivia pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was useless. The mansion was inside her mind, twisting her thoughts, turning her fears into reality. Olivia forced herself to look away from the mirrors, her breath ragged. She couldn't let the mansion control her. It was feeding off her fear, using it to warp her perception. She needed to stay grounded in reality, to remember why she was here. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out a small pendant, a keepsake from her late mother. She gripped it tightly, focusing on its familiar weight in her hand. The whispers faded slightly, retreating into the background like a restless murmur. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "This isn't real," she whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. "You're just reflections. You don't control me." The reflections in the mirrors flickered, their twisted faces blurring for a moment. The room itself seemed to shudder, the air growing colder as the mansion responded to her defiance. She felt a wave of nausea, as if the house were trying to force its way into her mind, to fill it with its darkness. Pushing against the wave of fear, she turned to the far side of the room. There, set into the stone wall, was a narrow door, its surface covered in symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. She approached it cautiously, running her fingers over the carvings. They were intricate, ancient, and pulsated with a strange energy. The whispers grew louder as she touched the door, rising to a frantic pitch. "Don't open it. You'll be lost forever," they wailed, echoing off the mirrors. Olivia hesitated, her heart pounding. She knew that whatever lay beyond this door was the key to the mansion's power. It was the heart of the darkness that had infected the house, the source of its twisted reality. Olivia forced herself to look away from the mirrors, her breath ragged. She couldn't let the mansion control her. It was feeding off her fear, using it to warp her perception. She needed to stay grounded in reality, to remember why she was here. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out a small pendant, a keepsake from her late mother. She gripped it tightly, focusing on its familiar weight in her hand. The whispers faded slightly, retreating into the background like a restless murmur. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "This isn't real," she whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. "You're just reflections. You don't control me." The reflections in the mirrors flickered, their twisted faces blurring for a moment. The room itself seemed to shudder, the air growing colder as the mansion responded to her defiance. She felt a wave of nausea, as if the house were trying to force its way into her mind, to fill it with its darkness. Pushing against the wave of fear, she turned to the far side of the room. There, set into the stone wall, was a narrow door, its surface covered in symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. She approached it cautiously, running her fingers over the carvings. They were intricate, ancient, and pulsated with a strange energy. The whispers grew louder as she touched the door, rising to a frantic pitch. "Don't open it. You'll be lost forever," they wailed, echoing off the mirrors. Olivia hesitated, her heart pounding. She knew that whatever lay beyond this door was the key to the mansion's power. It was the heart of the darkness that had infected the house, the source of its twisted reality. The story will continue with sections 8 through 10, further developing the narrative and culminating in Olivia's confrontation with the mansion's malevolent force. Shall I proceed with the next sections? Taking a deep breath, Olivia gripped the pendant in her hand, feeling its reassuring weight. She stepped toward the door covered in symbols, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. The whispers around her intensified, swirling into a frenzy, each one screaming a different warning. "Turn back. Don't look. It's not too late." The cacophony was deafening, but she pushed forward, determined to uncover the mansion's dark secret. With a trembling hand, she turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast and dark, with only her flashlight to pierce the heavy shadows. At the center of the room stood a large, ornate chair, draped in a dust-covered cloth. Around it, candles burned with an unnatural, flickering blue flame, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The air in the room was freezing, and each breath she exhaled formed a mist that lingered eerily in the stillness. Olivia approached the chair cautiously. As she moved closer, she felt a deep hum in the air, a vibration that seemed to resonate with her very bones. The whispers around her grew more desperate, now begging her to stop. "Don't do it. It will trap you. You'll become one of us." They cried, filling her with a sense of impending doom. But she couldn't stop. Not now. The truth was within her grasp. She reached out and pulled the cloth away, revealing the chair beneath. It was intricately carved, the wood covered in symbols similar to those on the door. They glowed faintly in the dim light, pulsating with an ominous energy. A cold breeze swept through the room, and suddenly, the shadows on the walls began to shift and coalesce. Slowly, a figure took shape in the darkness. It was a human form, but featureless, made entirely of shadows and whispers. It stood motionless before her, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Olivia stared at it, her heart pounding. The mansion had taken everything it had absorbed, the echoes, the fears, the memories, and manifested them into this ghostly figure. This was the core of the mansion's power, the entity that had been listening to her since she stepped inside. The shadowy figure moved, raising a hand that rippled like smoke. The whispers surged, rising to a fever pitch, echoing in her mind until she thought she might lose herself in the noise. "You can't escape. You're ours now," they taunted, each word laced with a venomous certainty. Olivia felt fear grip her, threatening to paralyze her on the spot. But deep inside, a spark of defiance ignited. "No," she shouted, clutching the pendant around her neck. "You don't control me." Her voice reverberated through the room, momentarily silencing the whispers. The shadow figure faltered, its form wavering as if struck by an invisible force. The mansion seemed to groan in response, its walls creaking as though in protest. Olivia stepped forward, her fear transforming into anger. "You've been feeding off the echoes of people's fears," she said, her voice growing stronger. "But I am not afraid of you." She lifted the pendant, holding it out toward the shadow. The figure recoiled, shrinking back as if burned by the light of her defiance. The symbols on the chair glowed brighter, casting eerie patterns on the walls. The air around her began to thrum with energy, and the room shook violently. The candles flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Olivia felt a rush of wind as the shadowy figure let out a soundless wail, its form dissolving into the air. The whispers turned into a roar, then slowly faded into a soft murmur, like the dying echoes of a forgotten memory. The floor beneath her feet trembled, and she stumbled, falling to her knees. The darkness pressed in from all sides, squeezing her like a vice. She closed her eyes, gripping the pendant tightly. "This is not the end," she whispered to herself. "I will not become part of this house." A blinding light suddenly filled the room, searing through her closed eyelids. The pressure lifted, and Olivia gasped for air, collapsing on the cold stone floor. Slowly, she opened her eyes, blinking against the brightness. The room around her was transforming. The shadows receded, the chair faded into nothingness, and the walls brightened, revealing aged but ordinary stone. She staggered to her feet, her legs trembling. The whispers had ceased, replaced by a deep, unnerving silence. Olivia looked around, trying to catch her breath. The mansion felt different now, less menacing, more like an empty, decaying relic than the living, breathing entity it had been. She had confronted the darkness within its core, and it seemed to have lost its grip. Wiping the sweat from her brow, she turned toward the door, her path now clear. She walked back through the mansion's winding corridors, which no longer twisted and changed around her. The house had become still, its power broken. She descended the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing softly through the entrance hall. The echoes were just sounds now, devoid of the sinister mockery they had once held. As she approached the front door, she hesitated, glancing back at the mansion's shadowed interior. The air felt different, warmer, as if the house were finally letting go of its long-held secrets. She pushed open the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The stars twinkled above, and for the first time since entering the mansion, she felt truly free. Turning to face the mansion, she saw it in a new light. Its windows stared blankly, no longer watching or whispering. It was just an old house, empty and hollow. She had faced its darkness and survived. But as she stood there, a faint whisper brushed against her ear. "We'll be waiting." Olivia shuddered, but refused to look back again. She had her answer. The mansion wasn't just a building. It was a repository of fears and echoes, feeding off those who dared to explore its depths. She walked down the path toward the iron gate, each step carrying her farther from the haunting experience she had just endured. If this eerie journey through the House of Echoes left you breathless, make sure to subscribe for more tales of the supernatural. Share your thoughts. How would you confront a house that listens to your deepest fears?